All right, so we're in April, and where we left off, where you should have left off, they just gone to the New York Yankees game. The players all knew who Mrs. Baker was. Tell me why they knew who Miss Baker was. They also wanted a classical design for their stadium upgrades. I wonder if we know anybody who does classical type of architecture. I think we'll find out soon. Mrs. Baker's picture was in the Hometown Chronicle 2 days later, standing next to Danny and Doug and me, and all of us surrounded by smiling Yankees players. I wore Joe Pepitone's jacket to school, and Danny wore his hat, and Doug wore Horace Clarke's hat. 3 sixth graders asked for my autograph on a baseball, which I gave them. Coach Quattrini, however, did not ask for an autograph. He kept his promise, and the next cross-country practice was about as hard as 2 practices put together. And since he believed in democracy, he said, he figured that everyone should have the same cross-country practice. And so all 7 of the varsity runners ran like Brutus and Cassius were after them with long and pointy knives. The 8th graders loved me after that. They threw all of my clothes in the showers, and I walked home, leaving puddles at every step. So you can already see where these 8th graders are having problems with the 7th grader who's running better than they are and giving them extra work. And so let's find out what happens at the race. So when spring break finally came, it dropped as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Spring break. Were there any 2 words ever put together that make a more beautiful sound? Spring break. Let me tell you, the days were warm and green. Danny, my T, Merrill Lee, and I met at Woolworth's in the afternoons. We ordered Cokes and hamburgers for as long as our allowances held out. Spring break. The high school is out too, and so my sister was always in a happy mood. She had a new friend named Chit. That really was his name. And he drove a yellow VW Bug with a bright pink and orange flower decals. He was mostly legs and arms and hair, and he came over every afternoon and would go down to the basement with my sister, and they would listen to her transistor radio and then come upstairs singing about yellow submarines very loudly and laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Afterward, Chit would follow him into his yellow Bug, and my sister would go driving around with him. Spring break, warm and green days. You know they aren't going to last, but when you start in on them, they're like a week of summer plunked down as a gift in the middle of junior high school. They mean the smell of dust and grass on a baseball diamond, the first fresh sea breezes that come all the way inland from Long Island Sound, all the maples decked out in green and gold leaves. They mean checking the tennis rackets to see if winter has warped them while they hung in the garage, and watching the first rabbit running across the lawn, then neighbors putting the first free kitten sign up on their stoops. That's spring break. You come back to school thinking that it's no longer just the end of winter, it's almost the beginning of summer. And you figure that you can hang on until the end of June because the warm breezes are coming in the window like quiet happiness. Simile. That imagery that I just wrote about back there, I'm not going to tell you specifically where it was, would be a really good visualization for your bookmark. Coach Quattrini had made us swear on the lives of our firstborn children that we would run hard during spring break. He promised he would find out if we missed one day, just one day, and that we would pay dearly. So when we got back to school, he began the first practice with this announcement. Every runner on the varsity team was going to have to better my tryout time with the Rats by 35 seconds. No exceptions, and no rats to help. Let me tell you, the 8th graders were not happy. Once we got started on our run, there was a whole lot of spitting to the side, timed with the wind, which I had to keep watch for. And I kept well to the back of the pack, since we ran through neighborhoods where there were kids from school who knew me and didn't want to find myself in front of their houses with my shorts pulled down to my ankles. I was glad that Doug Switek's brother wasn't a varsity runner who knew what would happen then. It was when we were all back from the run that first day and standing around the gym doors trying not to die that Coach Quattrini gave his second announcement. There was going to be a Long Island Junior High School cross-country meet this spring just to work up excitement for the fall season. It's this Saturday, so you're all going to have to get up early and miss your cartoons, he said. I feel really bad about that, so badly I could cry. Boo-hoo. Be here at 7. Bus leaves at 7:01. We run at Salisbury Park, 3 miles at race pace. Winner gets a $100 savings bond. Not that I expect any of you ladies to win. Toads, beetles, bats. That night at supper, I mentioned the race. That will be nice, said my mother. Just swell, I said. Who's the coach? Said my father. Coach Quattrini, I said. My father considered this a moment. What's his first name? I shook my head. Everyone just called him Coach Quattrini. My father shrugged and went back to eating. You know where that was going. How far do you have to run, said my sister. I told her. You'll die, she said. I won't die. You'll never run over, and you'll get run over and crushed. It almost happened before, I said, with a bus. She smirked at me. Hauling Hood, the local town hero. Do you want a parade? How long is it until you go to college, I said. She smirked again. Not soon enough. She's not going to college, said my father. Silence, since this is one of those lines that gets everyone's attention. So, remember, Hauling is like he who shall take over the business, and she isn't treated very well. She's older than him, doesn't get the business, and now Dad says, you're not going to college. What? Said my sister. You're not going to college, said my father again. You've got a good job, and you're not going anywhere. A long pause. Do you know that Roy White is batting .429, I said. I am going to Columbia University, said my sister. My father pressed his fork onto his plate and crushed a lima bean. Columbia, he said. Columbia? Let me think a moment. Isn't that the school that's on strike to protest the war, so there aren't any classes? It's the school where students are striking against the war and against racism. Oh, the whole world is going crazy, my father said, and no place is crazier than college. You'll stay at your job and be safe. Safe from what? Thinking? You're staying home, said my father. My sister focused on her meatloaf. By the way, Roy White really was hitting .429, which was 205 points over his last season's average, which seems to me to be important enough to talk about at supper. So what was Hauling doing there? He saw his sister and his dad fighting. What was he trying to do? They were all asleep when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. Actually, I was almost asleep too when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. I think I got to Camillo Junior High only by instinct. It was cold and a little foggy. The kind of foggy that goes all through you so that everything feels wet and the cold starts to seep under your skin, and all you can think about is the warm bed that you left to do this to yourself, and you're wishing you had on your thermal underwear, and you're wondering why anyone would want to do this to themselves, and you see Coach Quattrini standing by the bus and shouting at everyone he can see, and you wonder even more why anyone would want to do this to themselves. Whew, that's a lot to read. Neither the fog nor the cold lifted when we got to Salisbury Park. The grass was long and wet, and the fog dripped down from the still fresh green leaves on all the trees. You could see your breath. You could especially see Coach Quattrini's breath because he was using it a lot, telling us where to leave our stuff, where to wait, where to stop waiting, where to loosen up, where to line up. I guess that was how he stayed warm. There was something like 20 Long Island junior high schools there, and some of them even had uniforms. Most of us just had the numbers the coaches gave us pinned to our shirts. My number was 113, which is not a particularly lucky number. Danny Hupfer's was 25, which, as you know, is Joe Pepitone's number. I asked him to change with me. Would you change with me if I had 113 and you had 25, he said. In a second, I said. Liar, he said. But when the JV boys race started, I cheered him on anyway. Standing on the sidelines between Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and a whole bunch of little Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee, who had come out to watch us run on an early Saturday morning. That's Merrill Lee for you. It wasn't easy to pick Danny out when they started, since there were about 300 runners on the line, and most of them had on white t-shirts. But after they left and headed into the deep woods of Salisbury Park and the thudding of 600 feet faded, we all ran to where the trail comes out for a bend and waited for him to pass. He ran through in a clump of runners, mostly bigger than him, 8th graders. Keep your arms loose, I hollered. Okay, coach, he called, headed back into the woods. And don't talk, I yelled after him. He probably didn't hear me. We ran to the next bend, and then he came past. He was out in front of the clump and running well. He shook his loose arms at me. Go, Danny, yelled Merrill Lee. Faster, you dang slug, I yelled. And he obeyed. He was sprinting when we saw his back disappear. Then we rushed back to the starting line, and we all screamed like crazy. And when he ran past in the top 10 and set off for the woods again the second lap, there were 3 more after that. We ran all over the field to catch him whenever he came in sight, me, all the Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee. On the 4th lap, he came across the line, the starting line, first. We went berserk. Even Coach Quattrini went berserk, jumping up and down on the sidelines just like one of the little Hupfers. When Danny disappeared into the woods, followed by a clump of 8th grade runners pretty far behind, we ran back to the first bend for the 5th time and waited for the sight of Danny. But it was the clump of 8th grade runners that came out first. And then a whole line of other runners, all red and sweating in cold, foggy air. Did we miss him? Asked Fairley. But we hadn't. Way more than half of the runners had gone by before we saw Danny limping past the first bend. Both of his knees were bloody. He did not look at us. So let's make a prediction right now. What happened to Danny? Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer had their hands over their mouths, and all the little Hupfers asked, "What happened to Danny's knees?" "I guess he must have tripped," said Mrs. Hupfer. She didn't know what might happen if a clump of 8th graders caught a 7th grader in the lead. We ran to the next 2 bends and waited. Danny was falling farther and farther behind. When he finally crossed the finish line, he wasn't last, but almost. His parents were waiting right there. His father took one arm and his mother the other. Marilee and I stood back, and we could see that Danny was almost crying, and probably not because his knees were hurting. He didn't look at us when Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer took him back to the car, followed by the pack of little Hupfers. Some of them were crying. Are Danny's knees going to get better? I guess cross country is also a blood sport. The varsity race was next. And I lined up behind the 8th graders, way behind the 8th graders. "Get up to the line," hollered Coach Quattrini. I moved up about a half inch. And probably that was why, among the 140 runners waiting at the starting line, Mr. Hupfer was able to find me so easily. "I have a message for you," he said, "from Danny. I'm not sure you'll understand it." "I'll try," I said. He said, "Beat the pied ninnies." "Do you know what that means?" I nodded. "Then there's a message from me," he said. He leaned closer. "Run them into the ground." But it's hard to run 139 runners into the ground, especially when the gun goes off and the thunder of all those feet take over from the thunder in your heart. For a minute, I thought that my sister was right. I was going to get run over and crushed, so I drifted off to the side and sprinted to move ahead before the trail narrowed. By the time I reached the first bend out of the trees, I was just behind the clump of 8th graders from Camillo Junior High. By the time I hit the second bend, we'd passed most of the other runners. By the time we reached the starting line again, the 7 of us were out front. Actually, the 6 of them were all out front, and I was running behind them. And at the starting line, this is what I saw. Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and all the little Hupfers were behind Danny, who had not gone home, but was standing there on his bloody knees and hollering as loudly as he could and waving his white shirt high up in the air. Coach Quattrini was going berserk again and seemed to be trying to levitate himself off the ground. Marilee was standing quietly, Mr. Kowalski behind her, and she held a dried rose with a ribbon as I went by, and Mrs. Baker was standing next to her, wearing her white sneakers. Who's not there? Makes me so mad. So we ran again into the deep woods of the Salisbury Park, the damp smell of pine thick in the air. It was as if I were running alone, the 7 varsity runners of Camillo Junior High. When I looked back over my shoulder, I could see only a few runners behind us, and by the time we were on the 3rd lap, we were starting to pass runners still on their 2nd. The fog had lifted, the day had warmed, and at times I could almost close my eyes and let my face move along the still dampened grass. And then I could find that I had come up right behind the pack of 8th graders, and they were looking back at me, and I slowed down. And look what I wrote. Don't slow down. Ugh. Of course, he's scared, and he has reason to be. When we reached the starting line again to begin the last lap, Coach Quattrini looked like he was having some sort of fit. I'm not sure that he knew what he was hollering, or if it was even English. Let me tell you, whatever it wasn't Shakespeare. All the little Hupfers were jumping up and down too, and Danny was still waving his shirt, and Marilee was waving her rose, which was losing its petals, and Mrs. Baker was screaming. Really? We headed into the deep woods for the last time. In the cool shade of the trees, I came up close behind the 8th grade pack, and at the first bend coming out, Mrs. Baker was waiting. Alone. "Hauling," she called. I looked at her. "Pass those boys," she said. And that was all it took. I glided as we went into the woods again and stayed close while the trail narrowed and skittered through some thick underbrush. When it widened through the stand of old pines, the eighth graders looked behind and saw me, and they strung out to cover the whole path. So I went around them, off the trail and through the pines, the needles thick and soft beneath my feet, the dead branches sharp and brittle against my face. And when I hit the trail again, I was ahead of them, and they were all sprinting, but they were sprinting on a cross-country trail in Salisbury Park, and I was sprinting through the cool grass of the outfield in Yankee Stadium, running down a ball that Joe Pepitone had just hit to right, and I was covering the ground so fast that my feet were hardly touching, and Ralph Houck was shaking his head. "The kid's good," he was saying. And then everyone in Yankee Stadium was on their feet, and they were screaming and screaming because now the California Angels were trying to get to the ball. I just hit to deep left, and I was rounding first, then second, and then third, and Danny Hupfer was waving me home with his shirt when I got there, and cheering erupted so loudly that I could hardly hear Mrs. Baker when she picked me up and told me to keep walking, and I could hardly hold the thorny stem that Marilee handed me. But I sure could feel it when she leaned close to my face and ... Well, I don't have to tell you everything. Whew. What happened? That moment when Mrs. Baker said, "Pass those boys," like, that's a really big moment. And I have biggest M there. And what I'm talking about with M is this momentum that he has through this race. And that really wonderful metaphor of him running the race, but his head's not even there. His head's thinking of that amazing trip that Mrs. Baker got for them, Yankee Stadium. And he's almost in this dream world of me playing like in the outfield at Yankee Stadium, which he can now visualize really well because Mrs. Baker, after that Mickey Mantle thing, got to meet Joe Pepitone and Horace Clarke, and then free tickets to go see the Yankees. Really amazing stuff. A great race, and of course at the end, Danny passes the boys and won the race. Pretty good stuff. I wonder why they didn't tell us what happened when she leaned close to his face. All right, I didn't tear up. Don't tell anybody. That's a lie. It's a great part of the book. All right, so I've decided from reading that while you guys are reading May, this weekend I'm going to come in and read all of May. So if you want to go a little bit ahead and read with me, that would be tremendous. Great book, great book, great book. All right, hope you had fun with that. Start May. If you want to wait, I think tomorrow I'll read some of May, and then over the weekend I'll finish it. So you can read along with me. We're going to find out a few more surprises in May, especially that classical upgrade to Yankee Stadium. Yankee Stadium, a big, gigantic baseball stadium. Coming soon. Good job. Bye.